Order, order. Welcome to today's session of the Health and Social Care Select Committee on the work of the Care Quality Commission. Today's session is about accountability. Accountability for providers, patients and families who rely on the CQC for assurance about the quality of care provided. Following the publication of the DASH review, we want to understand what went wrong, to land the CQC in this situation and what steps its leaders are taking to address the review's finding and restore credibility in the eyes of those it regulates and it serves. Before us, we have the outgoing chair, Ian Dilks. Thank you for joining us. And the new chief executive, Sir Julian Hartley. Thank you. Now, Ian, in your pre-appointment hearing to this committee, you told that committee that you do not think it is up to the CQC to sit in an ivory tower and dream up what it thinks good care looks like. At the moment, we are in a situation where it seems the regulator itself is not clear what good care looks like, as a result of the organisation's failures detailed in the DASH's review. And as a committee, we're keen to hold the regulatory community to account. And given the breadth and importance of the services of the CQC, we're starting here. So if I may start, Ian Dilks, given the failings of the DASH review, are you sorry?
Well, obviously, we are sorry for the poor performance on that bit of our activities covered by the DASH review. I'm sure we'll explore some of those in more detail, but the CQC has not done what it should have been doing over a period of time, but most particularly over the last year to 18 months. So, of course, yes, I and everyone else in the organisation is sorry for that.
What personal responsibility do you take as the chair for those failings?
We may want to explore in more detail later what went wrong. But obviously I chair the board. The board is ultimately responsible for the conduct of the organisation, albeit working with other parties. It has become clear over the last 18 months or so that a number of things, in particular the last 9 months, that a lot of what was happening was not delivering what was expected. I believe the board did take a number of appropriate actions about 9 months ago. So, of course, I would love to be sitting here saying, as the outgoing chair, that this organisation is in much better shape than everybody thought it was, not that right? And I can't say that, for which I'm personally very sorry. But equally, I do think that I and other board colleagues have behaved appropriately in very difficult circumstances over the last 9 months and taken actions at a time that were very difficult to take. So I'm happy to expand on that, but let me just leave it there for now.
You've been in place for longer than 9 months. So, some of this will have, been under what happened before. Was it only 9 months ago you started to take action for these failings? Did you just not know about them until 9 months ago?
If I may give you a little bit historic perspective, and I'll try to do it quickly because it's complex, sure. But then I'm sure you'll come back in more detail if you want. So the historical perspective, CQC formed in 2012, and about 2018 it decided it had to change. Two key drivers for that: the world was changing, it needed to change, and also a lot of its systems were starting to the end of their life. There was a risk that they just couldn't continue. So in 2018, 19, 20, they embarked upon a transformation and a number of changes which would have required some major systems changes as well. And consultants were engaged in 2020, and the work was flowing. In 2021, the board approved, with everyone's support, a much more ambitious strategy, which required a significant number of changes to the pre-agreed transformation programme, both in terms of ways of working with people and in terms of the complexity of the systems. It also had to take account of new requirements being imposed upon us in ICSs and local authority work, which again you may want to come back to.
Yes.
So that was the context. So then you say, well, if that was starting in 2020 and amended in 2021, kind of what went wrong? We've of course looked at this. I would say highlight four things. And of course I do have the benefit of hindsight. None of the current board were there in 2020 or 21. But what we can see, four things. Firstly, some of the strategic decisions that were made with the benefit of hindsight, were not the right decisions, primarily around the operational model. And I can expand on that, and Julian, I'm sure, will talk later about the changes that he will make in that area. Secondly, in pressure to get things done quickly, the programme was hugely ambitious. I would say too ambitious. It was a major transformation. It was going to cost tens of millions. It has. We'll come back to numbers later, I'm sure. And I can sympathise with why people wanted it quickly. Those you could see lessons. Probably the big surprise in here is that the technology didn't deliver. It was specified, it was signed off, it was approved, reputable contractors were hired, but simply it hasn't delivered. There are some quite unbelievable problems with the technology we've got, and again we can give you examples should you wish. And then last but by no means least, I just don't think the organisation listened well enough to a series of stakeholders, most particularly our staff internally. Probably didn't engage well enough at the outset. Transformation should be led by the people, but this was more a technology-led transformation. But also when staff started to raise concerns, weren't listening closely enough or hearing what was being said. Now, some of those, they're just history, we can't do anything about it. I would also say I think the risk management framework and the governance were not good. Mm-hmm. So I think of importance to this committee, so what have we done and what's changing? Two things I would highlight and then I should pause. One is that we have continued to improve both the governance and the risk management framework. We've made quite big changes, but I would be quite clear there is still quite a lot of improvement still required, so I don't want to mislead you.
That's at board level? You've changed how the board's structured?
Board and within the organisation. Okay. I'm thinking perhaps more within the organisation, but at board level as well. And one of the key missions, I think, for Julian, and I'm sure he'll expand on this, is how we get our people who stuck with the organisation through a very difficult period. And they do deserve credit for the way they spoke up. But how we get them on board and find a way of working. I don't want to steal Julian's thunder, but a way of working that better engages them. Perhaps the bit that I didn't address was timing, but I would say, and again, I'll skip a few things in just simplicity, but it was, although our staff were raising concerns, it was really towards the back end of 2023 into 24 as the transformation was coming to an end and the technology was being deployed, that the scale of the problems really became obvious. The technology rollout ended in March 2024. The board, which was the next board meeting after that, was May.
How often does the board meet?
Every 2 months. And it was at the May meeting that the board leaned in, is the phrase I've used, and demanded some significant changes. And a number of things followed from that. Let me pause there. I've talked for a very long time.
Thank you. I appreciate you setting out the timeline. And just sort of to come back, I mean, you're saying strategic decisions were made, and that's quite passive language, but presumably those strategic decisions were brought to the board for sign-off?
They would have been, yes.
Right. Yes. So you sanctioned as a board.
As a board.
Yes.
Sanctioned.
So do you feel the oversight between when those strategic decisions were made and then all the problems that ensued from that, did you feel that was strong enough from the board during that time?
I mean, it's impossible to say it was, given the problems we're now facing. But if I just give you a personal perspective on this, I mean, appreciate that the board is almost entirely new, and I'd also say the board was very thin at one stage.
Was the board almost entirely new when the strategy was brought to the board, or the strategy was brought and then there was a big change in the board makeup?
The original plans and then the new strategy were signed off by a board, none of the members of that board are still on the board today.
What happened?
Just a combination of natural retirement, and we had considerable difficulty in replacing people. I mean, when I arrived, one of my first acts was to work with the department to put out a specification for 3 new non-executives. So that would have been May 22. We interviewed in September 22, but they weren't appointed until June 23. So it was quite a thin board. On the executive side, again, there were some natural changes. Probably the biggest loss was that our Chief Inspector of Hospitals had a catastrophic illness towards the end of 2023. But we, so far, in fact, we're just about to kick off recruitment to replace him. But I don't want to make this as if I'm just sort of throwing everything back to a previous board, although I did say at the outset I have the benefit of hindsight that the people on the board at that stage did. But I think the question you're asking me is, could we or should have seen this before? I wish we had. But from a personal perspective, when I was considering applying for this role 3-4 years ago, I made extensive inquiries. Nobody highlighted any concerns to me at that stage about what had been approved or adopted. And certainly in the first few months there, although there were things that I wanted to see done differently, and I've highlighted shortcomings in governance and the risk management framework, for example, for the most part, with the possible exception of comments made by staff, we weren't getting evidence coming up to the board that there were problems. Indeed, as late as the spring of 2022, round about the time the transformation was completed, the reporting coming up to the board through the executive line was suggesting that everything was going to be working. Now, why did we change in May of last year? What created that? Effectively, the board had 3 sources of information. It had what was coming up through the formal reporting lines. It had what our staff were telling us, and it had what we were hearing from the market. Obviously, the staff was easier to hear in a way, but I spent a lot of my time speaking to others outside the organisation. And what we found as a board was that the feedback from our staff and what we were hearing externally was coalescing around one version of the truth, and it was different from what we were.
Were you lied to?
I think that would be unfair. I mean, there's a limit to how much we can look back in history, but I think people's understanding of what was being delivered was different. So on technology, for example...
Was it incompetence or was it on purpose?
There's no evidence that was the case, and that's not what I'm suggesting. But I think people who were delivering things genuinely thought it was working, and it wasn't.
Well, I mean, that's extraordinary. So the head of the organisation, presumably hearing the same thing from the sector and the same thing from the staff, they would have, you must assume they would have heard that, has one version of a truth, and you yourselves as a board are finding another. What do you call that, if it's not incompetence or lying? What word would you use for that?
There was clearly a failing in the information that the executive team had to understand what was going on that they were bringing to the board.
Well, I think people will make up their own words for what that might be. The issues that were, and to Julian, just to give you a break for a second, but I'm sure we'll come back to much of what you've said. I mean, Julian, where are we now with the organisation? No doubt very bruised, perhaps relieved. What did you find on day one when you stepped in as chief exec?
Indeed. So I started in the job on the 2nd of December, but before that, about 2 weeks before that, I wrote to all 3,000 staff to introduce myself and to ask them what they thought the top 3 priorities for the organisation should be, because I felt it was important that I had, before I set foot in the organisation, have a sense of where the staff were. I was very clear about where stakeholders were, given my previous role as chief executive of NHS providers. And what I found was, it was unambiguous that the feedback, which I've subsequently shared with all the staff, was that the number one issue was all about the problems that the new regulatory platform, this system that was implemented, have caused staff. Deep distress, a real sense that it's stopping them being able to do their jobs. It was highlighted in the Dash review, but I think what has become really clear to me through spending a lot of time with staff in the organisation and hearing from their concerns was just the depth and scale of that. And if I may, Chair, in the feedback, we got a lot of qualitative feedback in terms of comments. One that illustrates this, the regulatory platform and the IT systems, this is far and away the number one reason for low productivity, staff stress, low staff morale and poor staff well-being. The regulatory platform is not fit for purpose and is preventing us from doing our job. So it's very clear to me, and that was number one by some distance, by about a factor of 3 from the next key issue, which was workforce. And then concerns about the structure changes. And also in that top priority, a lot of people talked about the problems that the single assessment framework had caused. And I'm sure we'll return to that particular issue. So I've made it a priority to ensure that, if you like, we have that moment of truth, reconciliation, that sense of catharsis of where people are at, because it's vital, I believe, to make sure that we rebuild the sense of trust, the sense of engagement and empowerment of our 3,000 valuable staff, so that they in turn can ensure that we keep people who use services safe and we can support improvement across the sector. So that's been a very important part of my early time in the organisation. And together, and I can say more about this when you wish me to, we've set out the priorities to address the challenges that we face.
Yeah, we'll certainly come to that. I just want to come back to the governance point. So what specific changes have been made at the board level, given that that's what you would have been responsible for, Mr. Dilks, that help to address this moving forwards? Has the structure of the board changed? Does it meet more frequently? Has it changed its approach? Because there is an element of this that is a board failing, is it not? And what have you done to change it in preparation for the incoming job?
Well, 2 or 3 things. On the up until about 3 years ago, the overview from a board perspective of the transformations was done by a subcommittee of the audit committee.
Okay. So how many subcommittees do you have in the board, just to get?
Yeah, so it was a subcommittee of the CQC audit committee was providing.
Do you have what other committees are there? People and culture, presumably.
There was it was an audit committee, audit and corporate governance committee. Then we have changed that to an audit and risk assurance committee to give it a much greater focus on risk and risk assurance. There is a regulatory governance committee, which looks at the effectiveness of the operations of the way we go about regulating. The evidence suggests whether or not we're discharging our regulatory responsibilities. And then there's a relatively straightforward remuneration committee, which does the things you would expect for an arm's length body. So back to your question. Later in 2022, the feedback I had was that the subcommittee of the audit committee wasn't the right, and I totally agreed with this, wasn't the right level to be overseeing the transformation. So we moved reporting for that to the main board.
So that enormous transformation that affects the whole of the organisation was not being directly overseen by the board at main board meetings. It was being done by a subcommittee of a committee. Is that my understanding?
Right. I mean, clearly reporting was going up to the board, but it was being handled by a committee of the audit committee. So we moved that to the main board. I was always very keen that we have a much greater focus on risk in the organisation. So from a board perspective, we changed the remit, or amended the remit of the Audit and Corporate Governance Committee to Audit and Risk Assurance. We had an audit committee chair at the time who was well able to do that. Unfortunately, was required to stand down because of another role she'd taken on. So that was November of 22, and it regrettably took until February of 2024 to make a new appointment. So we didn't have a board chair.
There's a lot of churn going on, is what I'm hearing. But you're a constant in all of this.
Yes, that's correct.
And so, but you didn't have a sense of what was going on. Did you step in so you got more involved, so you could see what was going on? Was all of that happening? Yeah.
I mean, particularly in the last 9 months.
But before
as we've
that,
had change in chief executives, but even before that, I mean, it has been a very different role.
When did you personally start getting involved in the transformation?
Not in the delivery of it, no, but as part of the board, and the board as I say, it's changed, but I mean, as part of the board, we did get involved in looking at the progress on the transformation. The indicators and the information were being given in 22 and 23. As I said, at that stage, a lot of the problems that have now emerged, particularly on technology, which had been developed, but it was being delivered against a specification. There was no evidence to me or to the board, and it would have been very difficult to see this, that what was being built was not going to deliver what was required. It was only when it started to be rolled out that became evident.
Do you feel that the board and its structures now and what it's learned is better? I mean, that we are obviously going to have the pre-appointment hearing of your replacement, but that's not the entire board and the structures remain. Is it now, with the benefit of hindsight, would it have picked up these problems sooner? Or is there work that needs to be done on the structures, the governance structures within the board itself?
It's conjecture. I wouldn't say, looking back, if I was staying, I would change the structures beyond what we're doing. We have been considering some changes, but I'm not sure they're particularly relevant to this committee. But we have been looking at monitoring performance differently. What I would say is that it would be nice to have greater consistency on the board and the approvals from the department that allow that. Mm-hmm. So, I've indicated it took, depending on the definition of dates, between 9 and 12 months to replace those who are retiring off in 2022. It took 14 months to replace the audit committee chair. We have 2 NEDs standing down now. Yep. One has had to resign because of he had an executive role. He changed jobs. He's got a conflict. Another person is going at the end of January. They both have to be replaced, and it would be very nice if that could be done as quickly as possible.
We're going to come back to the role of the department, certainly. And I have one final question, then we're going to start diving into some of these more specifically. And perhaps it's to you first, Mr. Dilks, and then to Julian. What do you say to those families? Because you've talked a lot about the organisation, a lot about the workforce, quite understandably, but ultimately it's patients and families who you regulate who have potentially been failed by this. What would you say to them? How can they be sure that, say, the care home their mother is in or the hospital their child is being treated in, and the results of your inspections that have been done in recent years, are they safe? I'll start with
you. Just not to me or Julian?
Both of you.
Two. I think in the vast majority of cases, yes. I mean, what Penny Dash report, we gave a self-assessment when the Dash review started. So what she has got in her report reflects what I think we'd very largely come to realise ourselves. And it does show we're simply not doing enough inspections. There are some, and that has been a growing problem over 2 or 3 years. We've got questions we've able to come back to about some of the assessment work. But at the same time, I think it's important to say we've got a lot of very good people who try very hard day to day and do a good job. And
they're not here, you are. We're here to understand, how they can be better served as well.
Yes, but your apologies, but I think your question was about the organisation and people being kept safe. And yes. I'm saying there are clearly significant improvements we need to make to get the standard we wish to do. But I wouldn't want it to be thought that our staff, most of our staff, most of the days, are not doing a good job. They are. We need to give our people the tools to do the job that we want them to do. And it's the systems and the tools that are a significant part of the problem, which we will are in the process of changing. We'll have to change further.
Julian?
So the main objective of the CQC is, as you say, Chair, to protect and promote the health, safety and welfare of people using health and care services. And the Dash review was very clear that poor operational performance is impacting our ability to ensure that health and social care services provide people with safe, effective, compassionate and high quality care. So 6 weeks in, I'm hugely focused on addressing those shortcomings in order to improve where we stand right now. I'm sure we can come on to those specifics, but in terms of the number of assessments that we have done, 2,500 so far this year, which is significantly less than any previous year. Backlogs in terms of registrations, notifications of concern. There are multiple issues that need urgent resolution. That's what I'm focused on and working hard with the teams and indeed the board to get right. And that has to be the guiding kind of principle for us to make sure we are delivering against our core purpose and the expectations of communities, families, people who use services as well.
You can't just answer that with a yes or a no.
Well, sorry, forgive me. We're not delivering for people. I'm sorry I went round the houses on that.
No, yeah, okay, thank you, much appreciated. Jen Croft.
Thank you, Chair. Just to sort of pick up on that last point you made slightly, and then we'll move on to talking around particularly the single assessment framework in more detail. You mentioned the backlogs that you currently have, and you've also expressed that you recognise there is a need to change the way that the CQC operates. Do you think, and are you confident that you have the capacity to address the backlog while implementing the changes that are necessary?
I'm confident we've got a plan to go at it. First job is to make sure that we've got the ability to make sure that the regulatory platform, which has caused so much difficulty for staff, that there's a way of inspectors and staff actually being able to do their job in order to increase the number of assessments. So one of the key priorities that we've agreed is to do more assessments. And we're tracking that, and we've put in place a workaround, because the problem with the system was that literally inspectors couldn't get reports published because of the problems with the regulatory platform. So now we have, since the start of December, an approach that should enable us to do more assessments in order to get more of those done. On the backlogs of registration currently stand at around 29% over the 10-week target. That is another key focus, and I'm sure the committee's aware of the concerns expressed by the Care Provider Alliance, Care England and other stakeholders, that their members are finding it incredibly difficult in terms of getting services registered. So the second priority is around reducing that backlog of registration. So we've increased the number of staff involved in registration. We've had to move off that regulatory platform because that was one of the elements that just wasn't working. So now there's a different means by which people can register make their registration application, and hopefully that will start to move things through. I'll be in a better position to judge how effective this action will be over the coming, obviously, weeks, given we've just started implementing some of these improvements. And the other issue, if I may, on your question about backlogs of what we call notifications and information of concern, which go into the National Contact Centre. Addressing the backlog of cases there is another key priority for us, and that's something, again, which we put additional resource on. I've brought in some expertise from the NHS in terms of clinical team, because we need more clinical expertise in the CQC to tackle that. So those three areas of kind of backlogs and problems created by the platform are key immediate priorities, which we've talked about across the whole organisation.
Just to pick up on backlogs of notifications of concern, is this place providers are not being notified that you have concerns around the way that they've been operating following an inspection? These
are both requirement for providers to notify us of major issues and incidents and changes, and it's also the opportunity for people to contact the CQC with major issues of concern.
There's a potential there for quite significant safeguarding issues around people flagging things early on.
Exactly. Sorry.
And do you have an idea around the numbers of that backlog?
Yes. So we've got about 5,000 of those, and we receive around 800,000 a year. There's around 5,000 that are in that backlog that need working through, that haven't been responded to in the 10-day time frame. Those need to be fast-tracked. They are categorised into different priority levels in terms of urgency, and that's something which we're getting weekly updates on in terms of how quickly we're able to work through those, and I've brought in additional resource to tackle that issue.
And what's the longest that people are having to wait? What's the longest outside of that 10-day time frame? Do you track this?
I have. It's in my notes. If I may come back to you when I find that it is, but some of these, and it depends on the priority. Some of them do go back months.
Can I perhaps, if the Chair, just clarify? We don't necessarily need to or have to respond to people who've raised the point. The significance of this is that we need to look at it, and it informs our ability to see what further action is required. So it may be, for example, if you had several pieces of emergency coalition, that would trigger an inspection of a care home. They're not necessarily things that we need to respond to people about, but we do have a very good triaging system to make sure that when queries come in or points come in, that the most urgent are dealt with, which would affect safeguarding, for example, are dealt with more quickly. And those are policies that we've refined over the last couple of years.
That's the concern, isn't it? That the triaging system is effective. If you've reported something that you have a concern around, it may need further action or it may not. You need to know that someone has seen that, who knows,
yes,
make an appropriate decision. And it feels like at the moment there is a potential for that to go very badly wrong for individuals and for their families. So an assurance that, that's heading in the right direction, that backlog is being prioritised.
Absolutely. That's as I say, it's a top priority for us to tackle. We've got to get that backlog down. We brought in additional resources to do that, including clinical expertise on that very point about triage and making sure we're dealing with the most urgent safeguarding whistleblowing cases earliest.
Thank you. I'll just move slightly on into the single assessment framework in general.
You found those figures before we do.
Yeah, so the oldest cases with no review, the first stage is a risk review, is 30th of November 2023. So the oldest cases with no action, 19th of August 2024.
So would that be someone has made a report of a concern and they've not received a response since August?
I believe so. We will write to clarify exactly where we are with that.
That would be very helpful. Thank you.
You can appreciate the level of shock that I think we felt on that, and without understanding what that particular case entails, there could be a significant issue behind this. I'll just move slightly on from this with the single assessment framework. The development and implementation of the single assessment framework appears to have been a failure. It's muddled, it's confusing, providers don't understand what good looks like, inspectors don't necessarily understand what they're looking for. Who was responsible for the development of the single assessment framework, and how did it come to be such a mess?
I pick up the first part of that. The single assessment framework was all part of the transformation programme that I've referred to earlier. The design principles were reviewed and signed off at the time the programme was initiated. It was I try not to repeat what I've said previously, but as things were being rolled out in the early part of last year, we were getting the feedback that you've described, both from externally and internally. That was why the organisation as a whole, but particularly keen for the board to commission the work from Mike Richards to get an understanding of what the problems were and what needed to be done about it. I personally got involved in meeting with Mike as setting it up, and Mike came to talk to the board. So we now have, I think, some useful feedback from him. Now, it's important to say he's tended to focus mainly on health. We have a separate piece of work going on well, not separate, joined with him. Somebody called Vic Rayner working with the team to look at the implications for adult social care. That work is ongoing. I can't give you an exact timing, but I'm rather hoping that they will be able to report to the next board meeting, which is in February, of their findings and what needs to change. I think some changes we've made almost immediately as a result of Mike Richards' feedback. The other things, they require a little bit more thought, because the single assessment framework was developed for a purpose, and we want to make sure that in any redesign that's done, that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, and we capture what needed to change and what we need to continue. So that we're down to the time. Obviously, our people have been trained and supported to a newer way of working, so this isn't just something you can switch off. We have to make a decision and provide some consistency for our people, and it's one of Julian's priorities to deal with that.
I think what I was trying to understand is what went wrong in the design of it and the development of it. Because clearly the reports, the Richards report, the Dash report, have commented that it doesn't work, doesn't do what it's supposed to do, it doesn't provide a single assessment framework. You know, you've got 34 different quality statements, it's sort of pick and mix depending on provider, and that's not a single framework by any means. What went wrong in the development of this, that when you're looking at changing the system, when you're looking at coming up with something not necessarily entirely new, but modifying that's there, what are the lessons that have been learned as to when this system was designed and developed that, you know, you can now take and go forward?
Let me get into first response to that, and Julian may wish to add. I mean, it may sound odd to say this, given the way you phrased the question, but quite a lot of, my understanding is quite a lot of co-design work was done with providers. We certainly did go and talk to providers as part of the development. What I think we've realised, particularly in adult social care, is there is a broad array. I mean, it ranges from big international groups to much smaller providers. Something like 80 or 85% of providers have less than 50 people. And what works for one maybe not work for another. So without getting into the detail, the concept of a single assessment framework, exactly the same in health and social care, it was well-meaning.
His brainchild, was it?
So?
His brainchild, was it?
Well, it was...
An individual? Was it a committee?
The principle of trying to align the way we look at different types of provider was an entirely laudable one. And certainly when I arrived, the way it was explained seemed sensible. But it was too ambitious, or not ambitious.
Whose idea was it?
Sorry?
Whose idea was it?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Whose idea was the single assessment framework?
Well, it's been described as
Was it the board's idea?
assessment.
Was it the chief exec's idea? Was it the head of a department's idea? Whose idea was it?
Well, sorry, I understand the question now. I mean, it was the executive team, particularly the chief executive, but we have a strategy team strategy and regulatory people who did a lot of the more detailed design work. So, I mean, a significant part of the organisation is involved in the design. And, I mean, given the problems you now find, maybe this is surprising, but, I mean, you know, the changes were made for a good reason, and some of the changes probably are still valid.
I can understand that they were made for a good reason, and I think there is definitely something in making sure that people have an idea of how their health provider is assessed, that they can make those kind of judgments themselves. But what I am asking is, it clearly doesn't work. Something clearly went wrong in the design of it, in the development of it. You're now looking to potentially redesign the system. What went wrong there that you're not going to do again? You've mentioned you've spoken to providers, you've mentioned you've spoken to people, but what specifically did you do or not do, that you're not going to do again, or that you're going to do this time?
Sorry, I digress to answer the other questions. I mean, so key question is, so what have we learned and what do we do differently? I mean, again, Julian should talk about what he plans to do, but some of the ambition was probably wrong. I mean, the idea of a single assessment framework as the same in health and adult social care. Frankly, there are different views on how much it was ever intended to be single, but it won't be. We have to cater for that. There are different approaches. Some of the core principles are the same, I mean, this is ultimately driven by the need of the users of services. So, the core purpose is to assess whether or not they're going to be safe and of the right quality of care. And those objectives are consistent across health and adult social care. So have more consistency perhaps than existed many years ago is what I would describe as a laudable objective. But the systems are different, so you're not going to have complete consistency. And then it perhaps was over-engineered by the assessments being made at too low a level, which was one of Mike Richards' clear recommendations. So I think the main learning from all of this is there has to be very much better working with the provider community and learning what works for them. It's partly around methodology, but it also has to be something that works for them. I mean, I do stress, ultimately, we're there to make an assessment on behalf of the user systems. We're not there to provide a service specifically to providers. But you can't be an effective regulator if you are doing your job in a way that causes friction with or confuses or creates difficulty for users. So we have to listen more in the next design phase and come up with something that keeps those very core principles but is workable and can be done at a level that enables providers just to get on with their job. But Julian, do you want to add?
I'll just quickly pick up what are those core principles? Because on one hand you've said having a single assessment framework is laudable, and on the other hand you said having you can't unite both the health and the social care sector because there's clearly you can't have consistency across both in one single framework. So what are the core principles that you're driving at that will modify the way things going forward?
If I may respond to that, I don't think it's possible to have a single assessment framework for all of the different sectors that we regulate. A care home, GP practice is very different to a major teaching hospital. The learning from this, I think, is, and indeed picking up what Professor Mike Richards wrote about as well, is that it was overly complicated with the 5 key areas of which people are used to: safe, effective, caring, responsive, but then 34 quality statements and 6 evidence categories, and then scoring at each evidence category of each quality statement. You enter a incredibly complicated, hard to penetrate, and actually a lot of our inspectors, people I've spoken to, say the scoring doesn't work for them. It removes too much professional judgment. It speaks to the point made about not having enough clinical expertise within the organisation, inspectors that understand the areas that they're going into and inspecting. So I would say, in terms of your question about key principles looking ahead, it needs to be clearly understood by those sectors we regulate. It needs to ensure that it's clear about what the CQC is looking for. Quite a lot of care organisations have said to me, when I met with a group of them, we don't know what your inspectors are after because there are all of these quality statements, there are all of these evidence categories. Just give us a clear sense of what you are looking for and what good looks like. Mm-hmm. So that, I think, is, and indeed is, work that we are doing to get to that point. But the point about engaging with the sector to make sure that there's a level of co-production of this, and indeed with people who use services, so that when they look at a CQC rating, they understand what sits behind it, are key principles behind what we do next.
On that point, sorry, I'll be very brief. Do you think single word assessments are fit for purpose in terms of when people look at a CQC rating, that they understand that the provider they're looking at will give the care for themselves or their loved one?
I think that it varies by sector and it varies by size of institution. We've moved away from aggregating ratings for individual services up to an overall rating for an NHS trust. But again, a major teaching hospital is very different to, say, a GP practice or a care home. I think single word ratings do offer a level of clarity and simplicity for the public, and that's certainly something that we've got to factor in. I think the single word judgment currently in use for bigger organisations like hospitals on well led is important in giving a view on the leadership of the organisation. I think our priority is to put our house in order on some of those key basics and then keep under review the idea of how we give a single word or two word judgment. But I think the first order priorities are to make sure that the sector and indeed patients and the public believe that we're offering a quality assessment and a reliable assessment of those institutions.
Thank you. Robertson.
Thank you, Chair. It seems the reviews have found a fundamental problem with both CQC staff and service providers understanding what good care looks like. How do we deal with that? And do we have a problem, and I would suggest this might exist in the whole regulatory world within this country, that good becomes a very technical thing and it becomes disconnected to what service users feel is good and what we mean by good in the everyday English language. Can you address that for us?
Yes, certainly. I think that's an important question in terms of confidence people feel they can have in what we say. I think if you go back to first principles and you look at the measures that most global health systems will use to assess themselves, go back to the Institute of Healthcare Improvement's triple aim, the importance of patient experience and outcomes, how patients experience or people who use services experience things, and indeed the outcomes that they get from their treatment. Secondly, the way in which those health services deliver for broader populations and communities. And thirdly, how efficient they are. Because one of the original parts of the CQC's role was to look at the efficiency and have regard to the use of resources. That's an area actually, given the pressure on health and care budgets right now, it's important that providers are offering the best sort of effective, efficient care possible, as well as excellent patient experience and with due regard to population health and health inequalities. If we work back from those principles, we get to a set of things that some of the quality statements cover, but the problem with the quality statements is they don't translate into what we call key lines of inquiry, which are very crisp ways of describing what good looks like. Breaking those kind of categories down, and one of my colleagues who goes to inspect emergency departments has actually done this. He's taken some of the quality statements that make sense for emergency departments, turned them into key lines of inquiry, being clear with those he's going to inspect what they are, put together the good practice and the evidence that supports those. It gives people a much clearer sense of what good looks like. And you're absolutely right that some of it does become quite technical when you get into the detail of the clinical processes. But in overall terms, I think we need to be better at having a clear statement behind each of those areas. What is it we're looking for from a public-facing perspective as well?
Yeah, I would suggest a well-intentioned measurement system, assessment framework with scoring, no matter how well-intentioned, does run the risk of becoming detached from what people think of and feel is good when they receive care. And I think that's going to be a challenge for you.
And if I may add to my answer, the current process, the current inspections do take account of a lot of patient feedback. That's an area that we need to develop and further build, because the direct feedback from patient service users is a vital part of your point, what good looks like.
If I could just turn now to problems with implementing new technology and therefore perhaps turn to Ian Dilks. At the beginning, you made that assertion yourself and acknowledged there have been difficulties implementing new technology. And then you suggested you could give an example, I think, later on. Can I invite you to give an example of the difficulties faced, using an example or generally, of the problem with implementing new technology?
Yes, but I also, Julian, may wish to add in view of a review we've commissioned. Without being too technical, the underpinning technology, Microsoft dynamics is actually was a sensible decision. I think the time shown that has worked. But around, we were using that technology to specify things that should be done in order to deliver both the portal externally and the regulatory platform internally. I mean, just to give you an example of how almost unbelievable some of this is, and Julian started to touch on this, it is possible for staff to start work on a report and put it inside the system and then get stuck. And we have got reports now that go back some months that are stuck in systems. People cannot get them back out. Now, there is no way on earth that anyone, I'm sure, would have designed a system to say, you know what, we're going to lose a report in the middle of it. But
Sorry,
that
can
is why...
can I just, when you say stuck, they're just somewhere in the system and you can't find them.
Get it. They've started their work, they've got all the evidence, they've done their job, they've just started to draft a report. At that stage, there's probably more information needed. It has to go through quality assurance, and they can't get it back out of the system. Now, quite how that happened is, it's unbelievable. You raised your eyebrows, Chair. And I can't actually, sitting here, tell you exactly how that happened. I'm just giving an illustration of the sort of difficulty. Now, we'd already, before Julian arrived, started to work with providers to see how some of this happened. You know, there would never have been a design principle, but was it a feature of design? Was it a feature of build or implementation? We need to know the answers to these. But when Julian arrived, and he's going to expand on this, he commissioned an independent IT expert to look at it. We've literally just had the findings. It's too early to comment on that. But clearly, one of the things we need to take account of is, how do we progress from here? One point I'm sure will come out of that, and it would be absolutely assessed with me, is to keep it simple. And we probably aren't going to be just change. Well, I won't be there, but CQC cannot be changing absolutely everything at once. We'll have to choose how to do things in a logical and sensible way. But clearly, as part of that, there has to be a much greater attention to working with users to make sure that we do not have a repeat of these quite extraordinary systems failures.
And if I may follow up on that, it was clear to me that we needed an urgent review of what had gone wrong and what we could salvage from the platform looking ahead. So the independent review that I commissioned we'll consider as a board next month, but I think the key issues were over-reliance on external consultants, not building up enough in-house expertise, moving target model, because this was happening simultaneously with the introduction of a single assessment framework and a major organisational restructure. So the stability of the organisation was thrown up in terms of those three major things happening simultaneously, which of course created a huge amount of destabilisation. And in that process, the health and safety review of that found that 33% of staff experienced physical and mental distress as a consequence of the implementation of this. So the importance of the engagement of frontline teams in any technological change, because implementation of new technology isn't just about a new system, it's about a change of culture and approach and way of working, and everyone needs to be involved in that. So in terms of looking ahead and lessons learned from that, I'm clear that we've got to work closely with those at the front line to make sure that any revisions to this, to try and mend this system, they're involved in.
If I could, Chair, just add one very quick point. One other observation I would make is that this was kicked off coming out of COVID in a virtual world, and I would never advise anybody to undertake a major transformation over Teams. So we have, over the last couple of years, started to bring people together in conferences and get much more engaged, but I think more can be done, and I would absolutely applaud the approach Julian has taken since he arrived to just engage with people right at the outset and get our people on board and supportive of and giving input to whatever changes we now deem to be necessary.
On this point, very quickly, Danny Beals, did you want to?
It was just, I think you touched upon a number of it. I was going to ask about sort of these technological changes, something that the NHS is grappling with more broadly. I think there might be interesting lessons here on how not to implement technological change successfully. I was going to ask about over-reliance on a contractor, and it seems that you were quite reliant on the contractor rather than in-house resources. Specifically on the involvement of staff in both the design and the rollout, you touched on it slightly, Julian, but I wonder if you could expand more generally. To what extent were staff involved in the design of the new technological solution, and to what extent were staff involved in the active rollout in terms of the ongoing assessment of its success in meeting what it was designed to do, any further changes that were needed as it was implemented on the ground?
So I'll caveat my answer to you with, obviously I wasn't involved in the actual rollout, but I can tell you from the review that I commissioned, and that independent consultant has spoken to around 100 staff, and they've given their accounts of their experience of this. It was clear there was just not enough of that engagement with staff in terms of that, and also there was not a willingness to listen to the issues that staff were reporting about the problems they were experiencing. And because of the deadline and the rush to get this done, there was insufficient testing of the system to make sure it actually worked and delivered. So consequently, when it went live, it just did not deliver anywhere near the benefits that were originally conceived. And the report that I commissioned will sort of set out chapter and verse, and Chair, I'm happy to share the findings of that with the committee.
I'd be very grateful for that.
And just very briefly, secondly, I think, Ian, you told quite a damning story about this technological solution not meeting in any way what it was required to do. That seems quite a major failing from the contractor who was asked to create this technological platform and solution. What contractual management is there of the contractor involved? What contractual mechanisms are there? Clearly there's been quite a lot of waste and disruption to productivity. What effect has that had on the contractor in terms of your contractual management?
And recourse.
And if you give me, I won't say too much about that at the present time. I mean, I hate to say, this predates me, I wasn't involved in the selection specification, but in many ways it was the right things were done. But looking back, we have very extensive involvement with an external contractor. Julian and I think, both share the view that doing more in-house would be good if we could. Now, there is an important caveat to that like many public sector bodies, we have pay scale issues. So recruiting people on board is difficult. That means the system has tended to use contractors. I'm not saying what was done for us was either good or bad. I'm just saying the context is use of contractors often is because it's very difficult to bring people on site at our salaries. An awful lot of use is made of contingent labour, which again paying a multiple of what it would pay if...
Sorry to interrupt, time is brief and this is a supplementary to someone else's question. So I appreciate that. It does sound like you lack in-house resource. I wanted to go back specifically in terms of recourse now for the contract, because you've been very clear, you were given something which was not asked for. It didn't perform as it was promised. The contract, in a sense, wasn't delivered to the specification. What recourse have you taken? What recourse are you taking against the contractor? What mechanisms do you have in the contract to enforce non-performance?
Well, sorry, I should have been clear earlier, but that's ongoing at the present time. So part of the review we can start to conduct anyway, supplemented by the work that Julian has commissioned, will be to look at what was asked and what was delivered against that by contractors.
Perhaps you can write to committee with a specific...
Indeed, and if I may add very briefly, of course, it's also about, as you said, the ability to specify and make sure the scope is clear of what external deliver. That is another skill set that's very important in the context of making these things work.
Yes.
Thank you. If you could write to us with more detail on that point, we'd be grateful. Paulette Hamilton.
Good morning, both. I want to concentrate on the concerns of the providers today and the staff. Yes. And In the report, the DASH report, it talked particularly about the increase in days. So it went from providers, if they needed re-inspection, it went from 87 days to 136 days. So it was 87 days in 2015 to 136 days in 2024. It then talked about re-inspections that required improvement, the rating, the days that it took again, 142 days to 360 days. I'm going to ask you first, Mr. Dilks. Have I got your name right? Dilks. Sorry, forgive me. The question I have for you, while this was going up and providers were absolutely shouting from the rooftop because it meant that people weren't being hospitals, it meant they were backing into the system, what was the board doing at that time to address that problem?
If I try to make 2 quick points, the first is that the most significant driver of the statistics you've been quoting is difficulties caused by the transformation, particularly when systems started to deliver. But I would say before that, as people were moving to new ways of working. So if you look at the number of inspections we deliver, I mean, historically, pre-COVID, it was about 17,000. It never recovered after COVID. It dropped to about 10,000. But at the moment, we're delivering a fraction of that level. So the question is, was the board aware, and then what did we do about it? Progressively, the board became aware, although supplemented by feedback from staff and people outside the organisation. Knowing there's a problem and knowing what to do about it is 2 slightly different things. So the board had requested action, a series of actions, to in order to speed up the number of inspections that we're doing, to reduce the sort of unfortunate statistics that you quoted back. But the organisation found it very difficult to respond to that at a time when it was attempting to complete a transformation and roll out new technology, which, as it then turned out, compounded the problems rather than made them easier.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to move over to you now, Sir Julian Hartley. Now that you're in post, question I'd like to ask you is, what are the 2 quick things that you'd like to see happen, e.g. for system backlog and registering and inspecting and re-inspecting services? So, I always like the 2 quick things. What are the 2 or 3 quick things that you think you need to do as an organisation to start getting some wins in this area?
First of all, do more assessments. The average age of assessments, and you referred to this in your question, currently in terms of going back is around 4 years. That's the highest it's been. Mm-hmm. We've got to get back to doing more assessments. So we're currently at 2,500. Mm-hmm. That compares that's the worst it's been since we started. And to do that, we need to sort out the issues with the way that inspectors are able to have the tools to do the job. So that's number 1. Number 2, I would say, because it's such an important issue, is what I was talking about earlier about backlogs in relation to information of concern, notifications. That's very important in terms of making sure we're dealing with key issues, key risks, and so on. If you would allow me to have 2 more.
Go on then.
We've got to get those 500, which Ian referred to, stuck assessments out. And we've got to speed up registrations so that you referred to the views of providers. I had a very, very challenging session with groups of colleagues representing care homes and social care organisations about their frustrations in relation to the time it takes to get services registered. So those are the 4 sort of immediate things we've got to sort if we're going to rebuild our credibility with the sectors.
And then I'd just like to add to that. CQC have been they've been a respected regulator for many, many years. People have really loved what you've been trying to do, but in the last few years that has slipped by what has been said today. So going forward, when you're looking at the work you're going to, the work with patients, the work with service providers, the work with staff, how do you plan to build that trust?
Great question, thank you. Number one, we've got to build relationships. We've got to make sure we get out there and we talk about what we're doing to try and solve the problems, and we talk to patient groups, people who use services, their feedback, as well as those providers. I'm doing that over the last the last 6 weeks. I've met with dozens of representative organisations in the NHS, in social care. Okay.
It's okay.
Sorry, I've got... don't worry, I've lost my train of thought.
Would you like me to continue?
Please continue.
Okay, so on that point about rebuilding trust and getting engagement with the sector, meetings with Martin Green at Care England, Carers UK, National Care Association, Independent Healthcare Provider Network, Care Providers Alliance, ADAS, LGA, organisations that represent people with learning disabilities and autism, and of course the NHS Confederation and NHS providers, which I formerly led. So all of those conversations are very important in terms of being clear about what the people that we regulate require from us. A lot of feedback as well from patient and service user groups. I think one of the things we will be doing in the coming months is reintroducing chief inspectors of hospitals, of mental health, of primary and community care, and of obviously adult social care. 4 chief inspectors with a view to bringing back the kind of operational delivery under each of those areas, to have the right expertise in the organisation to relate to those different sectors, so that people understand the issues and the detail in each of those sectors. And as part of that, we want to bring more colleagues that work in those sectors to be part of our work, so that they can add value in inspections and so on. Because when I ran a trust, I used to get involved with CQC as exec reviewer. You learn a lot. You learn a lot by going on a CQC inspection, and that transfer of knowledge and expertise and good practice, I think, is very much part of our role to sort of promote improvement. So I hope that answers.
And just finally, because I'm out of time, you talked about bringing in chief inspectors and all these people. How are you going to benchmark this? Because the CQC didn't just go down overnight. It went down over a period of years. Yeah. And the issue with COVID, and during that time, the lockdown just exacerbated it. So how will you benchmark that?
We want to get the best people. So we've agreed the sort of benchmarking of salary levels with the Department of Health. We want to make sure that these are people that are respected in their sectors, and I think the fact that the CQC is at such a low ebb in terms of where we find ourselves, I think there's a real opportunity for people to come in and support the work in something that I think everyone believes in, the importance of regulation in health and care. We've not had any feedback to say that the CQC should be completely abolished. It plays a key role. The fact is we need to renew, reset, and get people in that can really take us forward in building those key relationships.
Right, so you will be prioritising as part of that with your benchmarking things around backlog?
To be clear, 4 immediate priorities are set out, and alongside that, what I'm calling a series of foundational improvements, which include the things that we've been discussing, as well as, crucially, the development of a much more positive culture within the organisation, where we empower frontline teams, where they feel proud to be part of the CQC, and crucially where they feel free and open to speak up. We ask providers to have good speak-up mechanisms in place. We should be an example of best practice ourselves in relation to that. And at the moment, the staff survey reveals that a much lower percentage of staff feel able to speak up.
On that note, very good segue to Deirdre Costigan's questions.
Right, thank you very much, Sir Julian and Ian. I want to focus on exactly those issues around staffing and workforce. And I know that some of the changes that were made to how you staff, how you employ people in the CQC have led to some of the issues that we've spoken about today. And it's no wonder there's been a loss of credibility from the public and from providers when the DASH review found that there were people inspecting hospitals who apparently had never been to a hospital before, and inspecting care homes who had never met somebody with dementia, which does seem almost unbelievable. But how will you be looking at rebuilding that expertise in teams to address those concerns about a lack of not just in-depth sectoral knowledge, but having actually met someone with dementia or been to a hospital before?
Yeah, that's a fundamental point. We'd all expect those that are regulating us, and having been in the position myself of having experienced several CQC inspections in the past, the quality of expertise that comes into your organisation that can stand comparison with those you've got in the organisation that understands the issues is fundamental. So, in terms of what we're doing about it, the first step is to make sure that we really focus on making sure we've got a positive culture in the organisation, so people feel clear about their roles, their purpose, and the ability for them to not work in silos, but to be able to have a shared purpose across the whole organisation. We need to make some changes, because changes were made to the structure of the organisation in terms of a loss of specialist expertise. The DASH review talks about this, the kind of loss of that specialist expertise that's able to go in and understand exactly what's happening. Instead, more generalists went in with the kind of scoring mechanism based on the single assessment framework that simply didn't deliver what was needed. So we need to have chief inspectors in place. I'm hoping that we'll be able to make some appointments in the course of the next few months and have a team of those 4 chief inspectors in role, each of whom will then have teams that will be able to specialise in their sector areas. So in-depth subject matter knowledge in social care, in mental health, in primary care and so on, rather than a generalist approach. And at the same time, address the problems we were discussing earlier about the single assessment framework. So those teams feel equipped to do the job in terms of the key lines of inquiry. They'll be going into those areas to manage. Now, the other thing I'd like to do, which want to make some progress on, is to bring expertise in from those sectors. So plenty of people in the NHS, in social care and so on, have told me they want to support the work of the CQC. Over recent years, we've not had, in my view, enough people joining inspections from the sector, both in terms of staff and indeed service users and patients. We do have experts by experience. A number of them do join, but I think we can do more of that. So by making those big changes around chief inspector roles, aligning the organisation around those, drawing more people in from the sectors we regulate, and making sure we've got good quality patient, people who use services, perspectives as well, that should give us a much better, credibility, but also quality of output in terms of the inspections that we do.
Right, and I'm really delighted to hear that you're moving forward with the for chief inspectors. And I know the Richards report said that one of the issues was there was sort of a divorce between strategy and operations.
Yeah.
So hopefully that might go some way to kind of bridging that gap. But how will you make sure that you don't recreate silo working, but in a different way? Yeah. So it's kind of sectoral silo working. And how will you ensure that there is like a strategic overview, a step above those 4 inspectors?
Yeah, key point, because of course, given 10-year plan, the importance of integration, health and care working much closer together, it's vital we do that. So I would see that group of 4 working as a team, and making sure that we're regularly sharing insights and experience. We've got a data and insight function in the CQC that pulls information from many different sources. I think we need to use more outcome data. So, for example, there are many crossover areas where people with mental health challenges can often end up in emergency departments. So you've got to look at these things across the piece. We were asked to inspect integrated care systems, but we've paused that work because of the travails that we've been dealing with.
I'm going to come to this point in a later question.
Okay, thank you. But that point about integrated care, one of the most successful or effective experiences I had at the CQC a number of years ago was a thematic review of frailty across the whole of the lead system. And that looked at primary, social care, acute care, voluntary sector, all in the round. I think if we look at things through a thematic lens, you can make those joins in terms of the point you're making about guarding against silos. And increasingly, people's experience of healthcare is all about trying to find a way of it being seamless, not having to retell the story each time they go to a different part of the system. So I think that's an important part of our work.
Right, thanks for that. So what's your assessment of what staff morale is like at the moment at the CQC? Because you can imagine that people will feel sort of bashed a little bit. And what steps specifically are you going to take to ensure you don't lose I'm sure very experienced people who are still there in the CQC and want to do a good job and be part of, the future?
Absolutely. The first thing I say is I've had the privilege of meeting a large number of really, really good colleagues, fantastic people who are dedicated and committed to the CQC and want to see it radically improve. They've been and have felt deeply distressed by the position it finds itself in. And many of them have talked to me about how their concerns weren't taken on board. So step 1 is to make sure that we've got a positive, open culture that learns the lessons from the past, that makes sure that we, and this work has started, by the way, we are running a dedicated programme on strengthening the engagement of all 3,000 colleagues in what's our shared purpose, what's our vision, what are our values and behaviours, and how do we work with our sectors. That's critical because I think that frontline staff need to know that myself and the board are absolutely with them in terms of supporting their work. The staff survey done last year revealed that only 27% of staff believed that leaders in the organisation shared the values of the organisation. So we've got work to do here. That is a huge priority for me, and I believe, I always have, that if you don't, and the evidence supports this, the work of Michael West and others, that if you don't engage frontline staff and you don't have that sense across the organisation of that clarity of mission, purpose and engagement, you won't deliver for people that use services and to make the regulation work effectively.
When they say the leaders, who do they mean?
Sorry?
When they say the leaders in that survey, who
Senior leaders.
Senior leaders. So the executive team.
Yeah. And the staff survey from last year makes for difficult reading in terms of where staff are. So your question about where staff are, they are deeply distressed, deeply concerned. But I have to say, all my engagement, and on my first day I spoke to 3,000 staff over a Teams call, they are really clear and I believe open with me about where they are, and it's our job to build that way of working that gives them the confidence that they have a leadership that they can trust and that they can be open with, and also that we are building our strength in terms of the point I made about chief inspectors and clinical expertise and so on. And crucially, they want to see, and they're watching, that we address those immediate priorities that I spoke about to make sure that they see some improvements.
Right, and it's good to hear that you're rolling out this programme of engagement. But as you said, many staff saw the issues, they could see them clearly, and they raised them at the time. Do you have a whistleblowing procedure, and are you confident that it works? Is there any changes that need to be made, and will people be listened to this time? Yeah,
so that, again, crucial point. I studied a report that had been done prior to me joining, which was a major review of listening, learning and responding to concerns. That report was done in May of 2023. It set out some key issues and recommendations for the CQC. The Government Internal Audit Agency concluded through an internal review in December, it provided limited assurance on the adequacy and effectiveness of our arrangements. So again, we've got work to do there. There are still a number of recommendations outstanding. So I'm planning to use the work on culture and engagement to ensure we cover the issues around openness, whistleblowing, concerns, because reading that lengthy document, it's important to understand that we've got a number of areas in terms of how we listen to whistleblowing concerns, freedom to speak up, learning from employment tribunals, listening to our staff, expectations and experiences of people who raise concerns with us, and cross-organisational recommendations. Those key areas, all of which have a series of recommendations, need to be addressed as quickly as we can.
That's a lot of concerns. Do you have a clear timetable for that?
Yeah, we've got a plan around the work on culture to take us to the spring. I can't, and I'm happy to update the committee on where we get to by that stage in relation to those recommendations from the LLRC report, but it's got to be a key priority for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Back to ICS inspections, Ben Coleman.
Yeah, thanks very much. Good to see you here, Sir Julian and Mr. Dilks. Just on the ICSs, you just touched on the suspension of the assessment programme. What needs to be in place for you to restart that programme, and what timetable are you working towards?
Yeah. So, I think the first thing I'd say is what has to be in place is improvement on our current performance. The reason that ICS programme was suspended was simply because trying to do that at the same time as dealing with the current issues in front of us would be too much of a stretch for the organisation. So we've repurposed those staff that were recruited to do those ICS inspections on the key priorities that I was describing, because we need that capacity to deliver against the things that are, if you like, the fires that are burning that we need to put out. So that's why I agree with the point about pausing those. In terms of the timeline around restarting them, I think first of all we need to be clear about how we're going to do ICS assessments and what we're going to be looking at in relation to ICSs. I've already had conversations with Matthew Taylor at the NHS Confederation and other stakeholders about how we do this. Ian might want to comment on previous pilots that were done on ICSs. But I think that the issue for me about getting this right is integrated care systems and boards sit above a kind of geography, 42 of them across the NHS, different sizes. They have an overview of the connections between health and social care, of health inequalities, of population health, and so on. And they're not directly delivering the services. They're overseeing them. So we've got to be thoughtful about how our inspection approach once it starts looks at their particular role. In my earlier answer, I talked about a thematic review around particular areas of care. I think that might be an interesting way of thinking about this, and we haven't worked this through in detail, but certainly if you look across an ICS area at, say, frailty, or at care of older people, maternity, children, and so on, it might be that a thematic approach gives us more insight than just a review of a structure that sits above a series of providers.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And in terms of the timing that you hope to be able to achieve this within?
That depends on the speed at which we tackle the issues that I have outlined. I hope to be in a better position, and again, I'm happy to inform the committee of exactly when we think we'd be likely to recommence that. We're in conversations with the department about this. We're in discussion with member organisations so that we're not wasting time. We're talking about this, but in terms of actually getting people out there into those areas, leave that with me.
Okay. So,
Chair, if I could just add one quick point of clarification. There is a difference in ICS as now local and local authorities compared to everything else they do about the role of government and ministers here. So we do actually require specific approval from our ministers, or the department I should say, on the work we do on local authorities, which has been continuing, and on ICSs. So as Julian said, we did some pilots last year, but we never actually had approval from government to commence. I thought we were close, but then an election was called. So everything Julian said is right about us internally, but at the end of the day, the other crucial thing is we have to get approval from the department.
It's helpful.
interesting. Yeah. No, it is helpful. And I just a sort of declaration. I used to sit as the local authority representative on an ICB, I should say, and it's fascinating. The NHS part doesn't integrate. All the mental health hospitals, primary care, all those bits, they don't integrate well. And the other side, with the local authorities, is a challenge. And I note that neither of you has a background in local authorities, and yet we're not going to sort out the health system unless we sort out social care. And I appreciate that you're going to appoint an inspector who's going to look particularly at working on adult social care. How will you know? How would either of you know, seeing as neither of you have backgrounds working with local authorities, whether they know their stuff? And how will you be able to actually hold them to account effectively at a senior level?
So although I've not worked as an employee in local government or social care, I have worked with social care and local government for many, many years. I spent a decade working very closely with Tom Reardon in Leeds, who is now Second Permanent Secretary in the Department, and with Kath Roth, Director of Adult Social Care, and learned enormous lessons about the importance of social care in the context of what we were doing in the hospital, but across the wider community as anchor institutions and supporting people, both at home, in care settings, in the care sector. Indeed, the Secretary of State has talked about the work we did to move resources from NHS into social care to support more activity in social care. So I have a keen appreciation of the role and importance of social care in the context of health and care delivery across the country. And we did a lot of work together to ensure that we understood each other's roles, that social workers were regularly in the hospital and that our teams were out there, and that I think is a vital part of how we tackle some of the challenges we've currently got across the NHS and social care, particularly with the number of patients in hospital wards that would be better served in care homes, care, healthcare communities, home care. We've got a major challenge with the scale of staffing and funding in relation to social care. So I take your point about my background, but I would say to you that the work I've done and what I've experienced in relation to social care has given me a strong sense of its value, importance and crucial nature in relation to this work.
Thank you. So, and forgive me, I'm going to look forward rather than backwards on this, because there's a huge amount to do and to make better. So what sort of background would you expect your Chief Inspector for Adult Social Care to have?
I'd expect them to be a Director of Adult Social Care.
Right. And so if you work with adults, ADAS, the Association of Directors of Social Care, and Local Government Association, can I just come back to what my colleague said about, Jim Craft, said about one-word assessments?
Yes.
The ADAS, the Association of
Yes.
Directors of Social Services, the Local Government Association, and others have said you should look at what Ofsted's done and stop going for the overly simplistic one-word assessments. Will you do that?
I think I said earlier that we're reviewing our position in
That
relation
means you
to...
might, you're considering that as one of the options.
We're considering it, but I should say it's not our call ultimately. It's Secretary of State in terms of both local authority and ICS assessments.
You're going to be making a recommendation.
Indeed, and
will that be one of the options you would consider in making a recommendation?
So right now, lots of conversations. Talk to ADAS a lot. And LGA, we've started, we're about halfway through the local authority programme, so we're getting lots of feedback, 16 published assessments so far, lots of feedback from the sector about how that's going and how that's feeling. I think the key thing is to come at this from a perspective of how do we as an organisation support the improvement within local authorities, social care, and the same across other sectors, and how does the way that we describe services support that, and indeed account to the public? There's quite a few factors to think about, so apologies that I'm not giving you a straight answer on this one, but I think we're thoughtful about it. We'll be taking on board views and opinions, we'll be reviewing the evidence, we'll be thinking about where we go with it, but I would come back to my earlier point. We've got to sort out the basics in order to make sure that the assessments we do are credible and high quality.
I appreciate that. I was just seeking clarity on whether or not you are actually, the possibility of a one-word assessment is on the table for discussion at the moment, as part of the process you're taking place. I'm still not quite clear whether the possibility of it is on the table for discussion at the moment.
The possibility, certainly, as part of the review as we go and I think we committed to review the feedback on the process, and that would inevitably be part of it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And thank you very much. That's very helpful. And by you saying thank you, you've slightly distracted me from the final question I was going to ask. Just going back to the ICSs, a fundamental difference. There are many, many differences. The different parts of the NHS don't work well together, but there's a fundamental difference of governance between the way that local authorities operate and the way that the NHS operates, bottom up, top down, lots of things. Do you think that at the moment the staff you have in place are equipped to understand and make an assessment based on a proper understanding of that difference? So the DASH report notes that local authorities are fundamentally different. Do you think you've got the people who really get that in place at the moment?
Do, because I've met a lot of them, and we've got a lot of people that have worked in local authorities, social care. We've also got people that worked in the NHS, in primary care, in a range of settings. Part of what I was saying earlier to your colleague is that the way as an organisation we work, we need to be permeable. We need to make sure there's learning from those colleagues that are going into social care settings, care homes and NHS settings, and there's a clear understanding and appreciation between the different backgrounds our inspectors have of the merits and importance of those other sectors, because that's what we expect of those that we regulate, that there's close working between health and social care. So I do believe that at a sort of, in terms of the body of people within the organisation, we've got good experience and talent to be able to do that. What we lack at the moment is the, in broad terms, are those chief inspector level, bringing the operational delivery under each of them, and that's the bit that we need to get right.
Well, thank you. And by the way, I think your thematic approach is a good one, based on experience.
Thank you very much. Do you believe that the CQC's current budget is sufficient to fulfil its statutory duties and to respond to the failings outlined in the DASH report?
I think that we have got to make sure that we're not, first of all, so in short, I'm clear I've got to work within the budget I've got. And the way...
It's not quite an answer to my question.
Yeah, okay. So we're not going... This year we've agreed that in terms of fee income, which constitutes £220 million of our core income, that we're not putting fees up. Because I'm sure colleagues would agree that given where we are, it wouldn't be right to ask those that we regulate for more. I think there's more we can do internally to make sure that we're working efficiently and effectively. And I'm sure from what you've heard today, you will get a sense that there's a lot to do within the organisation itself to make sure that we've got the right use of resources, particularly given what you've heard about the deployment of the computer system, the regulatory platform, and so on. Originally, that was planned to save considerable sums, but of course those benefits have not been realised. So that does give us something of a challenge around what was forecast. But right now, I'm working with my team and indeed with the finance director to project where we think we'll need to be over the coming years, and next year planning to do sort of a zero-based budgeting exercise to make sure that we are clear where the resources lie. So I'm sorry I hesitated initially, but you'll understand I'm making a detailed assessment of our existing resource, and I'm conscious of the challenges that our regulated sector faces in terms of financial squeeze, and I'm not proposing that we ask for more through fee income, and we're talking to the department about specific areas where granting aid supports the work that we do on some of the potential work with ICSs and so on. So that's where we are. That's where we're planning to go. I think it's important to recognise that we will need to increase staffing in things like registration in order to get the backlogs down. We will need to repurpose staff on other priorities. But it's a moving picture at the moment. I'm making a clear assessment of that. 6 weeks in, I think that's as much as I can say to you about that.
So in terms of the allocation of resource, where do you see the split between doing the day job and putting in the reforms that you've been talking about? So from a resource perception.
Yeah. So in a sense, the changes that we need to make will be the day job. So that the sorting out of the immediate priorities, those 4 key priorities I discussed with your colleague, and then the work that we do to review and strengthen the single assessment framework, and indeed it won't be a single assessment framework because there isn't, I don't think that works, to build a culture of the organisation and to ensure that we've got the right operational arrangements. All of those I would anticipate we can go at without asking for a significant additional resource. There may be some things we'll need support with if we're asked to do more. For example, we see demand rising for registrations. We see the number of concerns that come in. That we've got to keep pace with demand, but I would also say that we've got to look to ourselves to maximise the resource that we've got.
So when you put in this extra resource to deal with, let's say, the reforms, the day job, etc., how do you ensure that once, hopefully, you've overcome those issues and are on a more secure footing, you keep that expertise and don't lose it because you go back to a point where things are running, inverted commas, as they should be?
Yeah, and you make a really important point about the expertise that we need. One of the peculiarities, as I found, of the Care Quality Commission is that the pay levels are different to the NHS. It's more of a civil service-based approach. That has had, over time, an impact on the differentials between Agenda for Change in the NHS and where we are. And that can be a challenge, frankly, in terms of recruiting at a level that is commensurate with what we need. Now, we're having to work through that and working closely with the department to make sure that we can get the right people in at the right level, particularly at Chief Inspector level. I would hope that my point earlier about bringing expertise in to work with us on inspections, to spend time with the CQC, not necessarily as permanent staff, but to come in and support some of the work periodically as part of people's development, as part of what people can do from other sectors, will help with that point about expertise.
Okay. Going back to the funding itself, you said, I think, that you want to transition to a new, simpler fee scheme. Can you just outline what you mean by that? And you were, I think, very clear that you weren't looking to raise the registered provider's fee this year, but does that simpler system mean you will be doing so in future?
Well, I answer that because, to be fair, the comment was made before Julian arrived, so I'll take responsibility for that. You'll appreciate there are actually, we have a total sum, and then that covers a number of activities. It's easier to focus on inspections, but we have 55,000 locations we have to register. We've got 65,000 new information that comes in every year. We've got 800,000 of the information of concern, etc., that notification. So all of that is a big infrastructure. And then you say, and how do we split that total fee out among people? It hasn't been looked at for some years. It does need looking at. We decided, I was chair of the board when we decided at that time that now is not a good time to be telling providers we'd like to look again at the way fees are allocated. That's a separate issue from the total quantum, which is your first question. But we just felt, this decision was made a little while ago, with everything else going on now was not a good time. So I would have, it'll be up to Julian, but I would have thought in the next year or so we need to look again at the basis of charging. Apart from anything else, the world has moved on, and where we're putting our activity into certain areas is now different from what it was. The intention was to be far more data informed in what we do. We haven't really achieved that because of the problems we've outlined, but if we do that, that will impact the relative effort between adult social care and health in particular, as well, of course, as the emerging fast-growing independent sector. So it's a bit of a long answer, but it does need to be looked at, but now is not the time, next year or so.
So I thank you, Mr. Dilks, for taking ownership of that, but Sir Julian, following on from that, where do you see that?
I think that I remember well signing off the fees that we paid as a trust for the CQC, and they weren't insignificant. And I think that if we think about the perspective from our providers, those we regulate, it's a non-negotiable part of obviously what they have to do. But I think we want to be able to demonstrate we're adding value. So I would say that what providers feel they get from us, not just in terms of summative kind of judgments, but also that sense of what are we doing to support improvement? How is our work helping be formative in terms of what good looks like, sharing best practice, bringing people together, as well as fulfilling the core function. So that, I think, is where I want the focus to be in order to make sure that people feel it's fair. We've got to deliver what we need to deliver. We've got 3,000 staff. We need to make sure that we have the right resources to do the job well. But I also think we want to make sure that people feel they're getting a fair deal in terms of the fees they're paying for the work that we do.
And I think you've been very clear. Can I just push you for a simple answer on whether you feel fees are going to go up in the next few years? Yes or no, or don't know yet?
Well, they've not gone up they've remained the same, my understanding, for the last 6 years. So I think I can't give a guarantee they won't go up. I think we're going to have to look at the prevailing conditions. As I said to you earlier, we're going to do a zero-based budgeting exercise next year. I'm sure when I come to see you next time, I'll have a clearer perspective on that for you.
No yet, sounds like. Thank you. Andrew George.
Thank you very much. Sir Julian, you described the one-word assessment system as having at least the advantage of being more publicly comprehensible.
Yeah.
In the light of that, would you think it would be fair to deem the CQC as you arrive inadequate? One-word judgment?
Do you know, I would say, and I'll explain why, because of what I've seen in terms of the teams I've met and the people within the organisation in whom I have got great faith and confidence, I might have said that previously. I would say requires improvement because I think there's the capacity to improve with the people that we have got and with the desire, willingness, commitment to address those key challenges. I think I absolutely understand your proposition, but I'm giving you my sense of where we are right now in relation to where I think we can go, given the people that I have met and working with, and the clarity of purpose that I think will bring to trying to improve the whole situation.
Okay, so you've gone native within the organisation and they're taking that view, but from an external, you think it would not be unreasonable for someone looking at the state of the organisation itself? I mean, I would add, perhaps preface it with the word shockingly.
Yeah.
When one considers the IT, debacle.
I would not disagree with that. I think that when you look at the deployment of the so-called transformation programme, those three things that were prosecuted at the same time, the difficulties that we've explored around the regulatory platform and the impact that's had on staff, and the psychological and physical impact of that, there is no doubt that has caused significant damage, and your characterisation in relation to that would be fair.
We'll move on. You'll be pleased to the nature of the inspections that you undertake. I mean, a lot of it seems to be kind of forensic and understandably needing to be forensic in nature. But to what extent are you sensitive to, if you like, the whistleblowers, the intelligence-led approach to if you like, pursuing inspections on the basis of that kind of intelligence-led approach?
Yeah. That's very important, and there is already an approach which is described as a risk-based approach to inspection, where a collection of issues, whistleblowers, can trigger a response, an inspection. Given what I said earlier to your colleague about the backlog in relation to information of concern, notifications, that's something we've got to sort out quickly in order to make sure we're on top of that, so that then informs the speed at which we're able to go into organisations. One of the other problems with the fact that we're only at 2,500 assessments is that we're not moving fast enough to go back to places that have been rated inadequate, that have got problems. So your point is key, and one of the other kind of foundational improvements we're looking at is data and insight. How do we make sure we're smart at gathering all the data, including all of that feedback from people that use services, staff in provider organisations that flag this, so that there's a consistent and rapid response to that. Good.
And just coming back in terms of trying to extract some benefit from the difficulties that the CCC has experienced, and following from Danny's line of questioning in relation to the technology contract that you had, the IT contract that you've undertaken. I mean, there will be lessons to be learned, which I think wider public sector could really learn from CQC. And I would really hope that the CQC could produce a report to say, this is where we went wrong.
Yes.
And this is where we would given another opportunity, put this right. Because it seems to me, I'm not an IT skeptic, but and I live in a kind of quill pen and parchment, kind of world that to a certain extent. But I mean, double run. Having a dependence on technology, over dependence on technology. If you're not doing, if you like, the mental arithmetic alongside the calculator, you're not sense checking what the technology is telling you. Then you are going to start believing, material which is extremely unreliable, and it would be really helpful to have. If you like, a statement from you that we, the wider public sector could actually benefit from your experience.
We'd be very happy to do that. The report that I commissioned is detailed in relation to the lessons and indeed what benefits have and haven't been delivered by this. I said earlier I'm very happy to provide the committee with those key findings, which hopefully will serve the purpose that you describe. My reflections would be that any major IT technology project cannot just be the preserve of those either contractors or people with IT knowledge. It has to engage everyone, and it has to be a whole change programme rather than just seen as a sort of technology implementation.
I mean, learning that you have reports that you can't get out of your system and you haven't kept even paper copies, or let alone, you know, Word copies on your on laptops or whatever, is just remarkable. And
yes.
I think people will be, I mean, we were all shocked. The drawers were on the floor when we heard this.
Well, I mean, I don't disagree, and it's exactly why when I heard from colleagues when I sent out the email and got all that feedback, that I immediately commissioned a review to understand myself exactly what had gone wrong and why.
Thank you very much. Becky Cooper.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Sir Julian and Mr Dilks, for being here. I would like to ask you both about the Department of Health and Social Care as a sponsoring body for the CQC. So, Mr Dilks, if I could come to you first, could you please tell us how that support has been for the CQC and for yourself, and perhaps any areas that you would like to see improvements moving forward?
Well, thank you. Interesting question. I mean, clearly the last few years have been challenging with changes of government or personnel. The department just at the moment has been taking advantage of a new chief executive coming and things they do, been very supportive, a number of discussions. We meet every couple of weeks. But I suppose I would, if I'm being completely honest, would say a little bit surprised by the extent of contact I've had with department, particularly at ministerial level. You may know I chaired another public body before for 7 years, and I was used to seeing the sponsoring minister periodically, and I did also meet the Secretary of State on a number of occasions. That hasn't happened in the last few years. Now, it's two governments, but I mean, I've had 6 Secretaries of State, and I think 3 sponsoring ministers at that time, and I haven't actually...
Sorry, Mr Dilks, just to be clear, the previous 2 governments, you haven't had regular interaction with the Minister or the Secretary of State?
No.
Okay.
And one of the reports, I think Penny Dasher's report did refer to it, and there's oversight in the sponsorship, and they're related because you have the same meetings. But I don't wish to be critical, but I have to say, having been used to chairing another body where I had those regular meetings, I'm a little bit surprised that I haven't had the same engagement with the ministers here, and I think that would have been helpful.
And Mr Dilks, did you get any sense as to why that was the case?
No. I could speculate, but I won't.
No, that's fine. And any other
the other point I would make, if I could, I said there were 2 things, but the other I've already touched on, that speed of response. You know, the fact that we know there's an issue across government. This isn't us or our sponsoring team. You've sure all seen the NAO report at the speed of appointing directors, but we were in danger of not being quorate as a board at a pretty critical time. So waiting 9 months for a cohort of NEDs and waiting 14 months for a chair of the audit committee. Was that the cause of the problem? Absolutely not. No, don't be clear. But it would have been helpful. If you assume that having a good board is a good thing, then it would have been helpful to have been in place. And the same thing applies on approval for pay scales. We have a huge degree of independence, but one thing we do need to do is get approval for posts at a certain level. The department was very helpful in giving me approval for the salary level we felt appropriate to recruit Julian. We got that by the beginning of September, and we were able to run that process that ended in 4 weeks. That was great. But I could give you other examples where we've been waiting for a very long period of time, and the Chief Inspector of Hospitals would be the obvious one. We have a vacancy there for over a year now, and we're just beginning recruitment. So I think that would be, as the outgoing chair, I can say that I think speed of response on key issues would be very helpful.
Just before I move to Sir Julian and ask a similar question, I just want to clarify, were you seeking meetings during this time that you needed? Were you seeking responses and just simply not receiving a response?
Right.
Okay, thank you. Sir Julian, I'm sure none of this is coming as a surprise to you, but I just wondered, with your incoming sort of appointment,
yes,
what your reflections are of the relationship currently and what you hope for going forward.
So my experience in starting in the role has been very positive in relation to engagement with the Department of Health, quarterly accountability reviews, budget and assurance meetings, fortnightly recovery meetings, with senior colleagues in the department, fortnightly policy and engagement meetings and regular one-to-ones, and the opportunity to speak with the Secretary of State. So I feel that I have a positive and engaged relationship with the department. It's clear to me that their expectations of me and what we as a CQC do, they're very, very clear about the need to address the issues that we've discussed today, and they are having, in my view, the appropriate conversations about those issues, and indeed looking to support the appointments that we want to make that I've described around those chief inspectors.
Great, thank you.
Can I just say, you are, I think, phrased the question slightly differently. Let me be clear. I mean, I have a very good relationship with the people I deal with day to day in the department, and I've already extremely grateful for the speed they responded to approval for recruitment with Julian. So we gave slightly different answers, but I was asking a question about what else could be done.
No, very clear. Thank you, Mr. Dilks.
Any Beals? Last question.
Thank you. Final question. I'm sure you're pleased to hear. It's been a bit of a marathon, so thank you for bearing with us. We've heard quite in depth what's gone wrong, the lessons that have been learned, the impacts, unfortunately, on the system of those failures, and what your priorities are. So, Julian, your 4 priorities for putting it right. Looking forward, the successful implementation of those 4 priorities, what does success look like for you in 6 months and perhaps the end of your tenure of the organisation? How should this committee judge whether your tenure and your priorities have been a success?
Important question. Thank you. Number one, restoring the operational effectiveness of the organisation, addressing the problems that are highlighted in both the Penny Dash report and also the work that we've seen from Mike Richards. Secondly, restoring confidence in the sectors that we regulate, so that the CQC is recognised as a regulator which not only is there to make sure that patients, service users, people that use all range of services are protected, but also is there to support the improvement of the delivery of services by sharing best practice, by being clear what good looks like, by bringing people together, by involving people in those services, in those sectors, in the work of the organisation. And I would say, crucially, holding up the mirror in terms of our annual State of Care report and the other reports and themes we do about the progress we are making collectively across health and care as a nation, and the key themes and issues that we are able to highlight, reflect on, and ensure that they are given a focus and priority where needed. And I would hope that we're a regulator that's seen as one that is fair, reasonable, good to work with, but crucially independent and absolutely clear about shining a light on the areas where service users and patients need to see improvements happen.
Yeah, that's quite an ambitious agenda. I hope you succeed. Should the committee have contact with you, written or potentially back in six months, what indications will we see practically about movement in direction? How can we judge whether the organisation's moved forward towards those goals or not?
No, that's fair. So I would say, judge me on those 4 operational immediate priorities are set out, where we've got to with key appointments in those chief inspector roles, and indeed where we are with the feedback from staff internally about how they feel about the leadership of the organisation, and what 6 months is probably not long enough, but what our sectors are saying about how they experience us. So we have metrics to judge performance on that. We've got a metric for each of those 4 immediate priorities, and indeed we do regular staff sentiment surveys to give us a view on that as well.
You share that survey and the 4 metrics with the committee and the follow-up. But thank you very much.
And then to Ian Dilks, we've got the pre-appointment hearing for your successor. What advice would you give them?
If I answer it in terms of what I think linked to qualities. I think independence, I know these committees are always focused on it, but I've chaired different bodies now for 10 years. I do think independence and being seen to be independent is hugely important. So independence, matter of fact, the way you act is seen to be independent is important. And I think that's particularly true for a regulator, given the fact we cover such a broad array. We're not just NHS or adult social care, it's a lot. I suppose the second point, I'll make three. The second point is make sure that both in selection of the board and its agenda, and indeed looking at things, one works with the North Star, which is the quality of care received. We have to work with providers. I've been regulated all my life. I know I've been a provider in a different environment. You have to work with the providers. That relationship has to be good. But at the end of the day, our purpose is not to regulate. Our purpose is to have the right quality of care for people, and we need to do that in a way that introduces the right balance between health and adult social care. I know this committee raised questions about my own experience in adult social care, and I can assure you I've tried very hard, both in the board and in its construct and in the operation, to get that balance. And that's not always easy with the pressures in the environment. And my third point would be, and to some extent this comes from the feedback I've had when it was announced that I didn't wish to be reappointed. I spend a lot of my time talking to others, an ambassador if you like, but it's a link point with others. And the words openness and transparency have come up a lot. I would sincerely hope that my successor will not be in the position that I've been. It's been a very difficult couple of years. But I would like to think that being straight with people, being open, transparent, our problems, and making it clear the board recognises and is dealing with it has been helpful. And I would commend both your selection and my successor, whoever that is, to continue that as an approach. So those are my 3 points.
Well, that, I thank you. The bell has rung. So I thank you both for the time you spent with us. It's been a very useful session. The providers, I'm certain, will have been tuning in. The patients, perhaps also. We will certainly be keeping in conversation with you, Sir Julian. And thank you, Ian Dilks, for coming and giving it today. Order.